People commit crimes for good reason to them. And if you live in a counterculture, or if these are the only choices you believe that are available to you, you might very well make these decisions because they make good sense to you. If I'm going to teach you something new, I can't shame you. I have to help bring you back to this place where we restore you and first, and then we can restore the community. But part of the conversation I'm having is that restorative practices aren't easy. We have to, and I think it's okay as long as Johnny kicked Susie and that's it, and don't do that anymore and whatever. But the challenges that we're facing are not just about Johnny kicking Susie. Johnny has done something egregious, and we don't want Johnny around. And that is the hard conversation, because we are afraid of Johnny, and Johnny's afraid of himself. Well, what do we do here? How do we restore that environment when someone has violated our sense of safety, violated our sense of dignity, made us feel uncomfortable? That's the conversation that we need to have, not the lighthearted, pushing someone off the swings. Let's work this out.
I'm Nikki Herda, and this is Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms, a podcast where we celebrate our state's educators and explore the future of learning. Bright is brought to you in part by MEMIC Insurance Company, insuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit memic.com/quote to see how much you can save. In today's episode of Bright, I chat with Eric Graves, who is the former statewide coordinator for the Michigan CARES program. Not long after this interview was recorded, Eric stepped away from this role to pursue another opportunity. But nevertheless, we're grateful for the perspective offered in this episode, rooted in his wealth of experience across numerous and varied roles in education. Throughout our conversation, Eric implores the listener to think deeply about our collective perception of those who have committed infractions, explores what true community healing requires of all of us, and offers 3 things to consider when implementing restorative practices. All right, Eric. Well, it's such a joy to have you on the Bright podcast today. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me about the most interesting project that you are working on right now?
Well, it happens to be Michigan Cares. I think it's outstanding that the state has provided an opportunity for all schools in the state of Michigan to have a free social emotional learning curriculum to be the base or the foundation for their mental health program. It's an online social emotional learning platform. It's a curriculum. It's K-12. The ideal is that you can get on as either an individual or a school and work on social emotional issues and challenges that you're facing, either as a school community or individual, things from vaping to bullying to harassment to sexual harassment to identification. Any of those issues are available on this social emotional learning platform. It has over 1,500 lessons. And it has a mental health component. It has a social emotional learning component. It has a restorative practices component. So it's a pretty robust system that it really allows the school to collaborate with the individual and the system in order to actually meet the needs of each and every student. It's pretty exciting. But what's interesting enough, it came out of a pretty challenging place. It came out of the pandemic, and Michigan Virtual networked with Navigate 360 to provide this opportunity. And it really is going to make a difference in the lives of children well beyond the pandemic. So it's pretty exciting to be the statewide coordinator for this program.
So it sounds like schools can use this content, essentially, these online lessons, to work with either students that have specific issues, like with vaping, for example, or educate, an entire group of kids, about these issues and just ways to deal with these challenges and think through them. And is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The good thing about this platform is that it's proactive. So you can actually integrate it in your day-to-day lessons. So you don't have to wait for a kid to have a particular issue. A lot of times when kids have issues, they're not in their best state to actually learn what's happening. Got to give them some time, give them opportunity to reflect. But if you can help build the tools for them to prevent the situation, then that's exactly what this curriculum does. And it spirals, so a kid is getting information year in and year out, and it's age appropriate. So it's a really good strategy. You don't want your mental health or your social emotional learning to be, retroactive or downstream. Once a kid makes a mistake, I got you. We want to teach kids what we want them to know. So it's very important that we program it in.
Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about that with us. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about a moment in time in which you vividly fell in love with education. So this could have been before you entered the field or just one of the many times throughout that solidified your passion for what you do.
So it's interesting. I remember I've fallen in love with education over and over again. So there are just so many things about education that excites me. The fact that we've got this proactive institution that is available for people to be successful in their lives, to integrate into the society. And I'm a civics teacher at heart, a history teacher at heart. So I really fall in love with it, but I really love education. But I think the time I can remember is I grew up in a challenging community. It was the projects in Martin, Tennessee. It was de facto segregated. There were challenges all around. And I went to school. And the first thing I fell in love with wasn't school itself, or it was actually teaching and learning. Somehow or another, what was being taught in the math class connected with what I was learning in science. And I was able to reconcile it and get it. And then somehow or another, I just remember getting this. I don't know what was happening all those years before that, but and then the language arts class was connected to the social studies class. And so everything just started coming together for me. And I just got excited about learning and connecting. And school was just a safe place where, I got school, I did school well. And that's when I fell in love with it. And I wanted to be a teacher, and then I wanted to be a principal at an early age, because I liked the fact that there was a proactive institution that you can be in this situation, but if you work hard, you can move. And I really, really enjoyed it. Yeah.
I love hearing that, and that, your own experience having those moments, those learning moments and connecting all the dots, like empowered you to want to offer that to other students. I love hearing those stories. And I know that you have had an interesting path into education. You played a lot of different roles. Like you said, you were, a teacher and a principal, and now, you're in your role as the statewide coordinator for Michigan Cares. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about that journey that led you to where you are today?
It started way back when, but I was in college and I was playing football at the University of Michigan. And I had a decent career, but it wasn't what I had anticipated it would be. And I found myself doing my student teaching at Pioneer High School. And I found that I enjoyed working with kids in the classroom and on the football field, because I was also a coach, as much as I enjoyed playing the game of football. So it kind of mediated, guys leave the sport and whatever, and they struggle. I didn't have that struggle. I really enjoyed the engagement, the challenge, the growth that kids were experiencing. So that was my first experience. I did my student teaching at Pioneer High School. Then I immediately worked in an alternative school. In fact, it happened to be the oldest alternative program in the country. I didn't know that at the time. Yeah. And then I went to a rather rural community, what I thought was rural at the time, which was Lance Cruz. Deer hunting season. Being a city fella, it was shocking to me. But I found myself after teaching in Lance Cruz and in Ann Arbor and in Southfield, I found myself as an assistant principal at Ypsilanti. And Ypsilanti their principal had just gotten promoted. And voila, I became principal. And that's where I really got rooted into how to make systems work for kids in education outside of a classroom. And then that matriculated I left education for a while because I had spent the last 15 years in a building. So I left and I went into corporate America for a couple of years, purchased a franchise, became a master franchise. I had that experience, but I had a heart for teaching and learning. I realized that was like really like my callings. A lot of people have an occupation, they have a career, and some folks get blessed with a calling. And so I found myself coming back in, and I entered into the charter school world. I was really sold on this idea that you can that a zip code shouldn't dictate the quality of education that a kid receives. So that was a wonderful experience for me. I've always done some educational consulting where I would speak and do these types of things, but my heart was moved toward Michigan CARES program because as a principal, I found myself really struggling with the social emotional learning issues that the students were experiencing. And I was a principal that was about creating an environment where teachers could teach and students could learn. And I loved teaching so much that I wanted to protect the sanctity of that environment. But the thing that I struggled with is being such a stringent rule follower during the zero tolerance and the no child left behind aspect. I found myself removing numerous numbers of kids out of education, not only out of the classroom, because that was the first element, more than 15 minutes of lost instruction and that impact, but then out of the building, because I had a lot of zero tolerance policies that were very effective for the students that were in the building, but not so effective for the kids that were outside. So I found myself in that space where I wanted to see what could be done to actually help kids get to where they needed to get to, as well as because of the environments I found myself working in. I recognized that there were staff who were some of the times experiencing secondary trauma because they would walk into these very devastating environments and they didn't know how to handle it. And they would take it home with them. They didn't have the coping skills or the strategies. And so they would wash out of the system before they actually ended up, getting to develop and grow. So I saw the need for social emotional learning. At the time, I was really calling it mental health. And it just so happened that the position at Michigan Virtual became available around social emotional learning. And I said, hey, let me step in this and see what this is all about. So voila, I'm here.
Thanks for sharing that. It's really cool since I've gotten to know you a little bit to hear your journey, and I think it does lend an interesting perspective to what we're going to be talking about today, which is 3 things to consider when implementing restorative practices. And so just hearing just the varied amount of positions that you've been in, from being a teacher to being a principal to working in, the oldest alternative school, that's pretty cool. And so that kind of helps to provide some context on where you're coming from with some of these suggestions. So thank you for that. So before we get into our 3 things to consider when implementing restorative practices, I'd like to just pause and unpack a couple of key terms here and set the stage a little bit. So if someone who's listening doesn't know what restorative practices is, would you offer us a definition in your words of what this is and why it's so important?
Okay, well, simply put, restorative practices are to restore. They restore the individual that was harmed, or what we might call the victim. It restores the environment that might have been harmed or disrupted. But it also is designed to restore the person who was generally wounded or out of sync that created the problem in the first place. People do things for good reason. So a lot of times when a student participates in a behavior that takes away from another person's liberties, freedom, that hurts the environment, they're doing it for good reasons to them. That was their best thinking at that time. So restorative practices not just restore the individual who was harmed. Restorative practice also restores or brings to anew the individual who committed the offense, and it works on the community. So it's it's a comprehensive whole child approach, a whole community approach to dealing with infractions or challenges that come up in a school community.
Thank you. I really appreciate that framing of really bringing out the restorative element of it and emphasizing that. And this is in contrast to zero tolerance policies, which, if someone isn't as familiar, tend to be things like suspension, expulsion, things that, as you said earlier, remove students from the building and maybe are effective for the students who are in the classroom, whose learning may have been disrupted by whatever the, infraction that the other student did was. But there's tons of research showing that those zero tolerance policies don't end up with good results, for the students who are suspended and expelled. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. If you have zero tolerance and if a kid commits an infraction, when I was at Ypsilanti High School, we had a 10-day suspension for fighting. We had zero tolerance. And if you fought twice or 3 times, depending on the grade level, you'll remove you from the school environment permanently. And so it was a very effective to curtail the violence, but it didn't curtail the violence in the community. And it also didn't address or deal with the issues that precipitated the desire to fight. So you don't really change behaviors, you delay or you prevent behaviors. And so putting a restorative practice program in place actually allows you to get at the behaviors before something blows up later. So you've got a kid in a student in your school community that gets suspended for fighting, and you do a zero tolerance, and then the kid integrates back in a couple of weeks later or whatever the case, but the issues or the way they address the issues are not resolved. And I've had times when I was high school principal where kids who had a challenge in middle school fought in high school. The same issue was prolonged for 3 or 4 years. And so you have to say that some of these issues don't go away, they just grow up. And so we want to say, how do we implement restorative practices and understanding the importance that it has, not only for the individual, like I said before, but for the person who did the harm, as well as for the community.
Yeah, it's helpful to get that comparison there to see, how these different approaches to school discipline, if you will, the different kinds of impacts they can have. And I really appreciate the way you described, delaying the impact versus actually like helping restore or heal. And that's the part that we're going to talk about today, is what does that look like when you start implementing the restoring and the healing alternative to zero tolerance. So I was wondering, just to help us visualize, what a restorative practices can look like, if you could talk a little bit about, it could be a real example or it could be a hypothetical example, but what might a restorative program look like in practice at a school, and how does that look and feel different than what some of us might have experienced growing up under zero tolerance?
Okay. All right. So a restorative program, I'm going to give you a hypothetical. A restorative practice may look something similar to this, where students are in conflict. And what's important about a restorative practice is not that you're responding after the incident has taken place. So once again, you have to teach a student what you want them to know, because the purpose of discipline is to teach and not to punish. So restorative practices, a lot of people don't know the restorative practices start before the incident takes place. And so you have to have a platform where you're teaching kids how to handle issues, giving it, taking it, working it out prior to someone committing an offense. If the first time we have a conversation about the offense is after the offense has been committed, or we take a student code of conduct and we say, we told you this, here are the consequences, see you later. I hope you learned your lesson. Well, learned what? I still don't know how to solve this problem. All I know is that if I fight, and now I'm going to consider, is that consequence, is that worth it? Because I still have this issue. So you have a lot of students who, in that type of a situation, will fight anyway, knowing the consequences and accept the consequences because you don't have a structure in it. So the important thing about restorative practice is to have a comprehensive program where you're teaching kids the right way of doing things or the functional way of doing things prior to engaging in the incident. And then when you actually do have an incident, for example, something like fighting, of course you've got to maintain safety first, right? You put kids where they need to be, and then we walk through how we came to this situation in the first place. Before you can restore something, you have to come to an understanding of what was the good reason. And they're always good. They're always good reasons. That's hard to understand. They're always good reasons to them. Right? What was the good reason why you did what you did? And how did that work for you? How is that working for you? Now that is the foundation, and you have to have that conversation or that structure first. What was the good reason that you did, and how is that working for you? Now, some of the times you can get stuck there because some folks, it was good for them. And there are and restorative practices does not mean that there aren't consequences, right? You still have to protect the learning environment. So that you go in, you identify the reason why it was done, the good reason why it was done. You connect it to the past learning experiences and the agreements that you've made. That's where the code of conduct comes in, right? Not alone, but the code of conduct. We made these agreements. We worked on this practice. Where are we at right now? And then we build a way of restoring the individual who committed the offense first. That's a hard thing to grasp. But a person can't restore something when they don't fully understand it. You don't want a superficial apology. So restorative practices are not, we are going to do this way every time. Doesn't work because people grow into that experience. So they don't eliminate suspension. They don't eliminate removing a student from the environment, but you walk that kid to a certain understanding. And restorative practices need to be a continuum from what happens in, say, a tier 1 situation all the way to a potential removal. Because suspension and expulsion is not the end of the world. But when it happens without some type of way of giving a person a way back, or giving a person a way to restore the environment, to first renew themselves and then renew the situation, the offense with the individual or the property, and then build a better community. Now, that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had learned a little bit about restorative practices before, but I'm learning in this conversation, so that's really cool. And I see your point that, it doesn't always mean never, having any sort of removal from the learning environment with suspension or an expulsion, but it's not closing the door completely, it's offering a means to make something right, or at least to help to restore it. Yeah. And then do you have any stories that you can share with us that illustrate the importance of restorative practices over a zero tolerance approach to school discipline? So I'm specifically kind of wondering about any students, and we won't use names, but any students that you've seen really be benefited by a restorative approach to discipline over a zero tolerance system.
So I had a student who had committed a pretty challenging offense, and we didn't have the entire restorative practices put in place, but we had some key elements to it. And one of the key elements is that we do things for good reason to us, right? That we are not bad, but we may commit bad offenses. And so that we're going to remove the shame from the conversation because shame freezes us, right? So I had a student who committed an offense that it was brought a weapon to school that he had used to rob someone earlier in that day. I participated, and this is that's heinous for people, right? Because of what we're experiencing. But this weapon he brought to school because he used it to do something outside of the school. So that we have zero tolerance for weapons. But the way you deal with it, that restorative practice to say, you did that for good reason to you. That's number one. Number two, we're not going to shame you. What do we do from here? But still lay out the consequences. Because of this, this is not a safe environment for you and for others. But we are going to find a way to build you back. So we still had to take the individual to the board. We still had to find alternative schooling because the students was a special needs. So special needs students can be expelled for out of school in entirety. They still have to receive some level of education. We placed that student in an alternative program, and they were able to graduate through. And they went on to a community college and had a relatively successful experience. To my day, that was 15 years ago. Versus the practices of you are the worst thing in the world. You shaming, right? Blaming and being fearful. And then we find ourselves in that state where now the kid walks away with shame and they don't try. And now these are their choices. Commit crimes for good reason to them. And if you live in a counterculture, or if these are the only choices you believe that are available to you, you might very well make these decisions because they make good sense to you. If I'm going to teach you something new, I can't shame you. I have to help bring you back to this place where we restore you first, and then we can restore the community. That's the best example I can give you. I could have found a nicer version of something that was not so heinous, right? That we're all comfortable with. But part of the conversation I'm having is that restorative practices aren't easy. We have to, and I think it's okay as long as Johnny kicks Susie and that's it, and don't do that anymore and whatever. But the challenges that we're facing are not just about Johnny kicking Susie. Johnny has done something egregious and we don't want Johnny around. And that is the hard conversation because we are afraid of Johnny and Johnny's afraid of himself. Well, what do we do here? How do we restore that environment when someone has violated our sense of safety, violated our sense of dignity, made us feel uncomfortable? That's the conversation that we need to have, not the lighthearted, pushing someone off the swings. Let's work this out.
I'm Nikki Herda, and you're listening to Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. Bright is brought to you in part by Mimic Insurance Company, insuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit mimic.com/quote to see how much you can save. Today, I'm chatting with Eric Graves, the former statewide coordinator for the Michigan Cares program, who in his many years in education has occupied a vast array of roles, acting as a teacher, principal, consultant, and more. Up next, we dive into Eric's top 3 things to consider when implementing restorative practices at your school. Let's dig into your top 3 strategies. So, what are 3 things that someone should consider when implementing restorative practices?
The first thing is understanding what restorative practices are not. It's very important to understand that restorative practices are not skipping over consequences. Restorative practices aren't you get to do whatever you want to do and you say you're sorry. Restorative practices are a transformation in how you see how we deal with infractions, challenges, and failure. If failure is not final, if people are allowed to make mistakes, if we create an environment where we can renew, then when you have that understanding of what restorative practices are, doesn't mean that there are not consequences, but we have an understanding what restorative practices are. They are a way for people to come back into a community and go back to contributing to that community. They're a way to make right a situation where you've harmed someone. But it also requires that the individual that has been harmed is receptive to being renewed. Because oftentimes the person that harmed someone was harmed themselves. So hurting people hurt people. So it's important that we understand what restorative practices are so that we can start to engage, because it's not just working with them, those counterculture people, those people that break the rules. It's also working with people who have been harmed. It's also working with that teacher whose classroom has been disrupted by 5, 6, 7 people, and they don't want that child back in class or the kid has said something that's defamed or dismissed them, hurt their feelings. It's about people who some of the times want to seek justice, because that's what we've been taught is what heals us. And we know that that's not necessarily the truth. I used to show a video of a young male picking on an older gentleman. And he's just picking on him. And the video is excruciatingly long. It's only about 5 minutes. But for 3 to 4 minutes, there's this younger gentleman, let's call him a thug, right? This thug just keeps picking on this older gentleman in the subway. He just keeps picking on him and picking at him and messing with him. He's provoking him to fight. And people are not doing anything. Somebody's screaming, y'all should do something. But pretty much he's just picking on this gentleman. And what ends up happening is you see in the corner another young man who walks by, and he slowly walks up to him. And right when the young man starts to pick on this guy again, he clocks him in the face. So I turn the video off and I say, how satisfying was that? That's justice, right? Feels good, right? It's not going to do it again. Not necessarily. Could just look around better, right? So we have to work on ourselves first. We have to understand what restorative practices are. And if we don't work on ourselves, and if we can't embrace this idea, because our school can talk about restorative practices, doesn't mean necessarily that our community is ready for restorative practices. Doesn't mean that we individually are ready for restorative practices. And so, so that's, are we ready? Do we understand what this means? It's a new way of thinking. And it really moves away from our whole process of how we right wrongs in our society. So it's not anti-consequences, but it is a new way of thinking about how we keep people in the community. How we keep people in the community. I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to throw you over the cliff. How do we keep people in this community? And so that's the first part, is understanding what restorative practices is and what it is not.
Wow. I was just thinking, I just hadn't realized before this conversation how much of it is, it's not just about the person who commit the infraction, and that's what you built toward with a few different examples here, but, that it is a lot of us, all of us in a community thinking about, our perceptions of how we deal with someone who does something that hurts us.
Yeah.
And it's, your examples continue to show, it's not pushing them out and getting out of sight, out of mind, just for your own comfort. I mean, that's one way to do it, but it doesn't actually bring healing. Would you like to lead us into your second thing to consider when implementing restorative practices?
Well, it really connects with the other one. Is your school community ready to implement restorative practices? One way that a lot of people like to start off is to say, hey, we've got a pipeline, a school to prison pipeline. We can't expel kids for things we used to be able to expel them for. So we've got this mandate to do this restorative practice. And the first time a community member hears anything about it is when somebody doesn't get suspended for what they expected to get suspended for. Or we don't put in the appropriate protocols in place for when someone is sincerely dangerous, and we say we were practicing restorative practice, and that's now the way you do it is you have a conversation. And one of the things that John Wooden used to say, you be quick but don't hurry. So you need to walk with some deliberateness because you're working on the way people believe, and it comes from their family systems of origin. And you have to, it can't be mandated. It has to be communicated. And so you start a conversation about what takes place, and you connect with people via informed empathy about why this is necessary and what are the consequences. And it's better to teach than to repair. And it grows. And that's very hard to understand, because the first thing we want to do, because we're not necessarily in schools, we don't necessarily build sustainable programs, is that we drop it in and say, this is what we're doing today. And a lot of times our community is not on board. So the first thing is having open conversations about restorative practices, dialogues about what does that look like in your community. It doesn't look the same in every community. Some communities are not going to formulate the way they deal and how they renew the community the same way another community might do so, for good reason. And so you start with an open dialogue, right, about what this looks like. We used to be able to shoot you if you stole a horse, right? So
yeah, things have changed.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to start the conversation, and then we have to set realistic milestones according to what your community views. That's not what people want to hear. We got something good, let's all do it. Not so sure, right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm making lots of connections today, which is great. So, would you like to lead us into your third tip for implementing restorative practices?
Once you have buy-in from your community, you now need to start to work on what is the foundation for restorative practices. And it kind of goes back to our earlier conversation about social emotional learning. If we don't have a sense of who we are, if we don't understand empathy, if we don't know how to move from the conditioning of our past, then we can't move into the future. So if we need to inflict, or we have to have the sense of justice, that means that another person needs to hurt because I've been hurt, then we're not going to be able to move forward. So we need to build a social emotional curriculum so that we can build the capacity of people to be able to engage in this work. And there's no end point, because we're continuing to move forward. So the first step is to have a social emotional learning curriculum that allows people to think about their thinking, and then metacognition, then precognitive, because emotions are precognitive, right? They're stimulus and response in between. Now we have to start to have a conversation about, okay, how do I rethink this? Because I feel this way, but I understand the reason why I feel this way is because these are a set of thoughts that have been conditioned to tell me this is what this is. So now I have to cancel some of those thoughts out, or rethink them, or restructure them, so that I now can have a different kind of conversation, so that it feels right with me. A lot of people in schools adopt a program because they've been told to do so, and then in their hearts and in their minds, they're resentful. So what they're going to do in that classroom after Johnny does something he's not supposed to do is they're going to set Johnny up, because they need to prove that they were right. They need to prove that emotion is right, because oftentimes we don't do what we want to do. We do what's familiar. And if we got resentment, then it's very difficult for us to if the teacher's not practicing it, the administrator's not practicing it. Somebody called me a such and such and so on, and now I'm upset about it. And every time I see him, I'm mad at him about it. If somebody called me a such and such and so on, and can I walk up and see the person and not the incident? So that takes a social emotional learning platform so that we don't take it personal, so that we think about the greater community, so that we care for the person even when they're hurting. That's what we need to do. Learn what our community is ready to do, have a comprehensive social emotional learning curriculum, and then use best practices. We're ready to roll. Thank you for giving me this chance to have this conversation. It means a lot to me.
Last question for you. Can you tell me about a teacher who had a positive impact on your life?
Oh my God, I've had so many. Well, the first thing I want to say is I still have a relationship with my high school principal.
Oh.
And it's been 30 years, and he sends out texts to a couple of folks from Bookville, but we can get on the phone and talk at just about any time. I have been blessed to have a whole host of teachers that, for whatever reason, took an interest in me and liked me. I remember a teacher saying to me when I was in math class, it's like Prego spaghetti sauce. It's in there, right? And I just loved it, just like, what's going on?
Yeah.
I had a teacher that was my English teacher, and I suffer from learned dyslexia. Meaning that the way I learned information is programmed in me, and some of the times if I'm stressed or whatever, I will revert back to whatever that process is, and it can be very devastating and difficult for me. It wasn't diagnosed until I got to college, so it was kind of interesting.
Oh, wow.
I had to,
yeah.
And so I had an English teacher, Miss Wilson, who she was adamant about preparing us to be able to take on whatever challenges that were facing us, that we needed to have, that writing was thinking on paper, and that we needed to be able to articulate our thoughts in a way that would allow us to interview or to share a complaint or any of the real life skills that were necessary. I could just go on, and I don't. And what's so interesting is that I think it's because I'm in education that I really embrace the number of people that just care. I could go all the way back to middle school. It's just been a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Without a doubt, it's challenging work to rethink the way we treat those in our society who commit infractions against us, and to create systems of school discipline that are more compassionate, community-oriented, and ultimately, restorative. But with leaders like Eric forging our path forward, if there's one thing we're certain of, it's that the future is bright. Your school could benefit from a free social-emotional learning curriculum. Check out Michigan Cares, which is available at no cost to all Michigan schools and districts. With Michigan Cares, students can understand how to manage their emotions. From learning how to set and achieve goals to making responsible decisions, Michigan Cares guides students, parents, and staff to turn struggles into strategies with over 1,300 lessons. There's real-time data reporting for schools, mental health and prevention content, and an option to add on a restorative justice program. To learn more, visit michiganvirtual.org/MichiganCares. Do you know someone who's an inspiring Michigan educator who should be featured on our show? Send us an email at bright@michiganvirtual.org to let us know who they are and why we should interview them. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. This podcast is produced by Libby Gaylord, is hosted by me, Nikki Herda, and is shaped by many of our passionate and talented colleagues. Bright is brought to you in part by Mimic Insurance Company, ensuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit mimic.com/quote to see how much you can save. The Bright podcast is made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Education is changing faster than ever. Discover new models and resources to move learning forward at your school at michiganvirtual.org.